Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Everyone who's here, I can't see any of your faces apart from my wonderful panel, which I'll get on to kind of introducing in a second, or put over to them to introduce. But just wanted to kind of do a kind of very short introduction onto this. So of course, called Strategy, Red Tape or Roadmap. And today I'm joined by some of the industry's brightest strategic and creative minds, who for the next hour will hopefully be able to help me unpick this brilliant relationship that happens between creative and strategy, really delving into kind of, the successes, the potential squabbles, hate to say it, but, we might have to look into turning this into a little bit of a therapy session, and obviously everything in between. But before I get into the topic in full, I'll start off by doing a speedy intro about myself. So I'm Viola Hazelrig. I'm a senior creative at the Romans. I have been at the Romans for 8 years, so very long time by the agency's standards. I started off in accounts and then became a creative strategist, which I actually believe I've spoken to Dan about before, about being a bit of a question mark of a role. And it was exactly that. It was a dual role where I was, slightly deciding between strategy and creative as specialisms within the industry. And spoiler alert, I actually went down the kind of creative line, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that, both roles are incredibly important in producing some of the most brilliant, kind of bold, brave work that we can see coming out of the PR industry at the moment. And that's exactly why I wanted to, to bring these brilliant minds together and talk about it a little bit more, delving into that relationship and really the learnings that we can take to make sure that, PR continues to thrive as it has been over the past few years. So quite enough from me. Who wants to go next? Dan, you're first on my screen. So over to you to intro yourself.
That's embarrassing. Hey, I'm Dan. I'm I lead the strategy team at Mischief, creative agency, part of MHP Group. That works for wonderful brands like Lego, 3, Just Eat, and many more.
Amazing. Next up, Olivia, you're next on the screen.
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia. I am a creative lead at John Doe, and I too started my PR journey in accounts, worked my way up to account management, and I was like, nah, this is not for me, and been a creative ever since.
Great. Eleanor, you're next.
Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor Sullivan. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at H&K London. So I lead a kind of insights and planning, but also head up a team that we call the Innovation and Creative Hub. So it brings together a heady mix of specialists alongside planners.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Jack.
Hey, I'm Jack Moriarty, currently at the Romans with Vi. I've been here for just under a year. I think it's coming up to a year, but spent about 7 years before then at GoLens. Started as an apprentice, kind of wormed my way into the accounts team, and then the rejection from kind of media was just way too much. So I moved into the creative team to get rejected by absolutely everyone all the time. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment, and excited to get into this today.
Fantastic. So a bit of kind of boring preamble from me just to set everything up. So the reason for this talk is, of course, that, strategy in PR is a relatively new specialism, traditionally something that's the reserve of Adlands. As an industry, we've seen the huge strength that it has into creating, really, really brilliant, bold work that, has seen us winning all the awards, through that really insight-rich work. But with smaller budgets, shorter timelines, all of the above, it has been said that strategy in PR has required a bit of a tear up of the rule book, so to speak, with every agency, every individual creating their own processes to ensure that obviously creative and strategy can work hand in hand to keep this strong work coming. So it's all about kind of delving more deeply into that process, really, and into the relationship between creators and strategists, who are basically like sibling departments, and that comes with strengths and with some learnings as well. So this will really be looking into the processes that work, the ones that don't. Is that process always linear? What learnings can these minds give us to achieving greatness? And finally, a bit more about these specialist skills in and of themselves. Are they earned? Are they learned? And how can budding talent crucially get into them, if there's anyone on this call who doesn't work in PR currently, is interested in it. So I guess some people have touched on this in their intros, but what might be quite interesting is just to kind of delve a little bit more deeply into everyone's journey to becoming the specialists that they are at the moment. You know, did you start out in PR? I know some people didn't, but you know, what was the journey to where you are now? And you know, any kind of value add you can add on who you are and what your role is. So Jack, why don't you kick it off for us?
Yeah, for sure. I think kind of, you know, the coming into the creative department is never like an easy part, right? Like I think when you kind of start off, especially for me as an apprentice, with literally no idea of what PR was, and it took me a while to work out what I was doing after I put down my orange apron of B&Q and then suddenly was in this center of London to working for all these amazing brands. And I think it really becomes where you kind of work out your skill sets, right? So like, you know, going into the accounts team, I think everyone has to kind of do that moment where they learn what a selling is and, you know, what kind of journalists want, and doing all the nice media meets and everything else, and really kind of getting into the groove of that. And then I feel like you kind of split into, okay, what am I good at, and how do I kind of go from there? For me, strategy and data just wasn't kind of it at that point. You know, I think I did a little stint in the Golin strategy department where I saw kind of an Excel of data and numbers, and I was like, I don't really know what to do with this, to work out how it is. And actually, the only way I've learned strategy is by doing creative. And I think we'll probably come on to a lot of how our roles are kind of the same. Like I think, you know, people don't see strategy as a creative role, but actually I think as you become a strategist, you learn a lot of creative, and as you become a creative, you learn a lot of strategy along the way. So definitely have warmed into that role, and you know, continue to learn so much every time I come up with an idea that doesn't fit the strategy, and try to argue it anyway.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think, you know, speaking to that like sibling department thing is actually like, as siblings, you're not too dissimilar. So switching it over to a strategist point of view, Eleanor, Dan, anything to add to that, and kind of telling us about your journey into strategy as a specialism?
Yeah, I mean, probably like a lot of people on this call, panelists included, I started out as a generalist. So I was working at Red. I worked at Red for a long time, and kind of got a planning bug from a guy called Ed Staples, who I always give him a shout out as the OG of PR planning, and that it was the late noughties and he was a planning director, and that was a real rarity. But I think at that point, the industry was starting to make some decisions about what kind of agencies people wanted to be, right? Are you going to be an agency of specialists or generalists? And I think there are still those different camps. I then went down a specialist route, got a role at Splendid, and from there have sort of always done strategy roles from back in the day when I was just sort of talking to Dan about being the person who looked after the front end of the deck, and then suddenly realizing that that was the job. And so, yeah, kind of found what I was good at during various great agency experiences, and just sort of doing this now for probably about 15 years.
Amazing. And Dan, you have come into PR. You started from an ads background, am I right? Can you tell us a bit about kind of that journey and how you came to be where you're at?
Yeah, this is probably the third career I've had at this point. I actually started my working life as a journalist. I worked in a wire service, and then I worked for glossy magazines in the US and the UK before somehow making my way into an ad agency. I got my first role in an ad agency. I was part of a new business team, and I was probably one of the worst new biz execs in Gray's 200-year history. But in that process, I found the planning department. That's who we'd go to pull the case studies together for the new business meetings and things like that. And I was like, these are my people. This is the kind of skills that I like. And then became the kind of journey to get in there and learn those skills and do that role. And I spent about 10 or 12 years working in advertising, kind of learning what sometimes gets called proper planning. It's not that proper a lot of the time, but you know, then coming into PR, I came into the PR world kind of in a crisis of faith. I wanted to work on kind of chunkier problems, more meaningful things, do kind of work kind of outside of consumer brands, and I spent a few years doing that, and I've been disabused of those notions now, and I'm kind of back where I'm happy in consumer brands and getting brands into people's passions and things like that. And it's fun finding new ways to use the same old skills in different ways. I constantly I feel like I'm now addicted to the kind of pace of the PR world, whereas before, it was, oh God, this is fast. But I have this sneaky hypothesis that 5 years from now, the rest of the creative industries, advertising or otherwise, will be more like the way that we work, rather than we will be more like they work. I think the kind of pace, time, budgets is trending more our way. So anybody working in kind of creative and strategy, in PR at this point in time has I think a head start.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, that, and actually something I want to come on to later in terms of obviously advertising, being the industry that first had these specialist departments, but obviously the process is so different. But before we kind of delve a little bit deeper into that, Olivia, I want to hear a little bit more about kind of, how you've ended up where you are, and your distillation of what your day-to-day job is at the moment.
So I kind of did the whole traditional route where you do an internship and then did tech PR, and doing campaigns about fiber optic cables just wasn't for me. So then moved into a consumer role where I was there for about 4 years, and then in those 4 years became a creative. But because it was such a small agency, there wasn't strategic and people that came up with the ideas. We kind of did everything. So now that I'm in this new agency, which is a lot bigger and there's different departments, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's people that do my job a bit. So it's interesting to work with others, learning to play nice with other people. It's just something I've done before, but it is really interesting and really helpful to have someone that kind of specializes in the strategy and you just use your brain power for the ideas.
Yeah, 100%. And I think on that point, actually, what's really interesting is, what we do day to day, kind of you learn it to muscle memory, right? Like the fact that we're constantly coming up with ideas, you kind of understand what the format is, you get into a bit of a flow. And this is certainly what I found doing my dual role when I was doing it, is switching from creative to strategy was completely impossible. It was just one of those things where suddenly you'd be like, it's one of those things you kind of adopt a muscle memory. And that's a really good point around the strength of specialisms. Want to jump straight into kind of process sort of stuff. So obviously Dan speaking about, advertising, and actually that's where the strategic profession came from in the first instance, but, also the creative specialism really kind of, if we're looking back at PR and how it's evolved over the last few years. But I wanted to speak about kind of the process in your agencies. It's because you've got such short timelines. Often you get a new business brief in from a client, either or an existing client, and you have 2 weeks to respond to it. So in those instances, what do you find in PR is kind of the regular process in terms of that response, and how do the strategic and creative departments work together to make sure that you're meeting those quite crunchy timelines? Anyone jump in? Who wants to go first?
I think when I was sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think when I was call it younger and stupider, I felt a little bit more of a kind of a control freak over the process, and I have to spend the time with the brief. I have to figure out where I'm going with it before I can kind of talk to anyone about it. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And when we kind of get the brief, it becomes more of a rolling process. I'm fortunate at Mischief, we have a fantastic strategy team, we have a fantastic creative team, we have a fantastic design team. So when brief kind of comes in, we have a really kind of organic rolling process. And the first thing I'm kind of thinking about with the brief is not what the answer is, it's what's interesting about it. And I try to get as many people kind of going or thinking on that as possible in terms of what's interesting about this brief. And if the business director and I are aligned on kind of the actual problem we need to solve in those things that are interesting, and the creative director and I are aligned on how to solve it, then, we're kind of off to a winner, and we can now start going a little bit further down the funnel of what are we going to do with these interesting things. I'm relatively new to Mischief, and I think we're kind of in this new phase at the minute of lots of sparky new ideas when you have a new team together. And about day 3, we had an idea for a new tool that we could help get wider insight a lot faster. We built a tool we call InCrowd that allows us to then also take these kind of what's interesting questions to all corners of the country, and do like little fast and quick and dirty, qual surveys and stuff with people, and just kind of sense check, ideas outside of our little London bubble. And so it's like trying to take this kind of very natural process of like figuring out what's interesting about a brief and just kind of expanding it to as wide an audience as possible before you have to pick a route to kind of go down and, ultimately pursue. It's really freeing in that way of like getting out of your kind of obsessive nature and into more of a widely discursive, let's bring people into it.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, there's in that's brilliant, because actually when you ruminate on a brief, it's often when the response is the most kind of narrow it could possibly be, but it's also remember you end up kind of pulling your hair out about whether you're doing it right or whatever. But yeah, Jack, do you want to talk about the process here?
Yeah, I mean, I think also just off the back of what Dan's saying with like, the point of like being expansive, like getting a brief that gives you so many ways to pivot and come up with so many different ideas is really like the time when my job is the easiest. And I think, the team, the Romans, we've been through, I definitely have, as that sibling rivalry. You kind of talk about Vi of just like, sometimes you get a brief and it can be quite kind of, now the strategy is quite narrow and it's quite focused and it's brilliant. And then I spend a day on it and I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm stuck. You hit that roadblock. And actually, when you start to work with the strategy team to actually, blow out that process, get in the Q&A with them, like, work alongside them and be good siblings and happy siblings, for that period of time at the start, I find that you then get to that point of actually, we've got loads of insights, or even bringing the wider team into those first moments to actually just kind of get the task that we've got and really blow it out and see how many places you can kind of take it, because that's really where I find that, from a creative point of view, you can be the most fruitful, right? It's where you're going to get the most ideas, when you can go to a client and say, we've got, 4 ideas and they're completely different. And I think when you go with 4 ideas that are very similar or kind of, all from a very kind of pointed insight or strategy, that's when I think it feels a little bit more restrictive. But not to say that also plays a role. Sometimes being really simple-minded is really beneficial to the creative process. But I think having that point of getting together, being able to stress test things and kind of see how many avenues different people can take it is really important to the creative process.
Yeah, nice. On that, and potentially a bit of a contentious question that people might not want to admit to, but is that process always linear? Does strategy always come first? Because obviously in advertising, traditionally, yes, but being honest with ourselves, what are your experiences in terms of sometimes having to do that retrofitting piece? Eleanor, I'm going to come straight to you with tons of experience in the strategy space. Tell me about if the process is linear.
I think, we've spent already in the first sort of 15 minutes of this call talking about advertising and the fact that that's where strategy was born. And that is, of course, true. But actually, I think what we all do is very different, because our output is different, our channel is different, and often our kind of KPIs are wildly different. So actually, our processes and ways of working should look very alternative, not just because of the terrifying timelines, but we always talk about concurrent working at H&K. So you have a kind of parallel work stream, whether that be with a behavioral scientist plus a data analyst plus a planner plus a creative, you're kind of all in on it. And that isn't inefficient. In a lot of ways, it's more efficient. So I don't think retrofitting strategy is ever ideal, because you should always go in with, a goal or an objective or, problem to solve. But equally, to Jack's point, if that strategy is useless, then it's not a good strategy. So, a strategy is useless, and yes, unless it's useful to the creatives. But I think equally on this call, we've already talked a lot about consumer, and we've already talked a lot about campaigns, and actually PR strategy, I think, is often a lot bigger than that. It's about reputation. It's about corporate brand. It's often about CEO profiling. It's about ESG agendas and, regulatory environments and policy. So, for anybody that's on this webinar that isn't in a consumer PR role or a consumer campaigning role, strategy still works in that way for the other briefs that might cross PR people's desks. But that point of view of, how do you work, and is strategy always first? No, not always first, but you shouldn't really retrofit a strategy. I'm a bit of a purist in that sense.
Yeah, nice. And you know, to that point, I guess we could go on to talk about, you know, in terms of both creative and strategy, often, you know, the best responses are the most simple, and we know that from. And so actually a strategy doesn't have to be 20 slides, and nor does the idea, because actually if it is, it's often not the best response. But I guess also just kind of going back a little bit, it would be great to hear from you guys in terms of, you know, work that you've seen recently coming out of the industry, or that you've created yourselves or has come out of your own agency. You know, can you give any really good examples of work where you can tell that the strategy and creative has worked hand in glove to create something incredible?
I get so I'm just going to say this because it was my favorite campaign, and Dan, this is a special shout out to your company. It was the it's He's Coming Home campaign was personally my favorite, just because it was just so simple. Like, it just worked really well, but because it was so simple, I don't know what the sort of back end in terms of strategy was for that, but I just loved it.
That was before I joined, so I can't take credit for that. But I mean, it's one of the reasons that I was like very happy to step into this role. That is a fantastic campaign, and it nails exactly what I love about campaigns that feel really strategically and creatively aligned. Is like it just hits on that like red hot insight that kind of takes the breath away when you see it, and you're like, none of these things. This idea couldn't have been better. Like, it couldn't have worked if it didn't have the super sharp insight, and it also couldn't work if it didn't have just like the really bold as brass creative execution. It's just a real tight package.
Yeah, it was a brilliant one. And again, kind of very culturally, obviously the moment that it happened was just such a kind of, you know, an incredible moment with the World Cup as well. Any examples? Or we can move on if it's too on the spot, this question. It's quite
I'll be probably really boring, and the one that a lot of people on the line will know is the Cannes winner for the PR category last year. So the Breakaway campaign for decathlon. And I thought you could see the strategy shining through. And I thought it came from a very PR mindset, which is, if you are as a brand about making sport accessible for everyone, then you have to make sure that that aperture of inclusivity is as wide as possible. So reach into the parts of society that aren't able to access sport for some, you know, huge reason. And in that case, they chose prisoners. And I just think the strategy in that was a remarkable way of challenging or calling out a brand's purpose. And some people say, or advertisers obviously often say, you shouldn't be able to see the strategy. I think it's great when you can see the strategy, but maybe that makes me a nerd.
No, I agree. I completely agree. And yeah, that was a brilliant one. I remember seeing that campaign video when it first came out and being like, oh my God, it's so brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I guess that links quite nicely to, you know, if we take it right back to the beginning of the process, before the work's being made, and we look at the client briefing process, so kind of where it all starts, where you guys, you know, start getting your thinking caps on. But I saw a really interesting quote the other day. It was floating around the LinkedIn sphere, and it was from John Griffith and Tracy Follow's book, 98% Pure Potato. And it said, and I'm going to have to read this, over time, briefs have become more focused on inspiring the creative idea than on the strategic work to determine the role of advertising or marketing in achieving the stated goals. So from both of your kind of, you know, your areas of expertise, how much do you think this is true? And how much do you think that actually, you know, the client's desired output is that big or singing or dancing sexy creative idea? Or, you know, how often are you asked to kind of, you know, do a pure play strategy? But yeah, over to you guys. Who wants to go first? Jack, I can see you speaking.
I was just about to go. Yeah, I mean, I think from a selfish point of view, I suppose, like, I love it when the kind of the strategy is really setting up the creative, because it makes my life so much easier. But I think definitely it's one of those things, right? When you're looking at the different type, it's the type of brief you're kind of getting and trying to work out exactly what you want to do. You know, when it's a pure kind of strategy play, that there needs to be a real focus on kind of, you know, why that strategy works, obviously what the reason is, who you're trying to reach, and setting it up in a really kind of clear way. Honestly, though, I think if I get a brief that literally inspires a creative idea and the creative idea is amazing, that's where we kind of get, maybe, and then we clash heads on the slight retrofit of actually, we need this big idea. We want something, you know, that's going to cut through in culture, and then kind of working out exactly what the strategy is to go into that. So I think, yeah, in a bias level, I think that I would agree and say that actually I love it when a brief sets up a great creative idea.
Nice. Anyone else? Anyone else? Swing it over. Dan, I feel like we've spoken about this quote in brief before. Yeah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think briefs need to be questioned, right? You need to you need to kind of bring some sort of understanding of the client's business to the task at hand. You need to make sure that the resources they're going to spend are being spent in the best way possible to achieve the long-term objective, and how communications can help in that. So I think as long as you can give yourself to kind of think of something without making sure that you have enough time to overthink it, you know, that's a win for kind of everyone. Everyone gets better value at the back of it. I really don't like the idea of, when we talk about like just creative response or just strategy response. Strategy without creative is kind of pointless. Strategy is meant to show you what to do or not do. If you can't then show the action that it's meant to inspire, like, you might as well just not shown up. And I really dislike the idea of creative without strategy, because when I worked in advertising, let's say, I got to see a lot of PR agencies' presentations, particularly in you know, interagency mixes and things like that. And you often will see these decks that look like they're meant to be weighed rather than read, idea after idea after idea after idea, with very little kind of cohesion or point. And you're just like, these poor people must be exhausted. They've come up with all these ideas and they're still not hitting the mark. So there's something, I think, that comes really in that positive tension of like, what is the best possible way to solve the problem we've been given, provided that problem is the right problem, and then like, how do we really bring that to life in creative? That those two things working in tension creates things I think are kind of uniquely special.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on your definition of creative and what you, as an agency or as the client, expect from an idea. So sometimes the right answer to the brief might be a kind of, I don't know, a behavioral science intervention, right, to drive a behavior change that you want, rather than an attention grabbing PR campaign. Those are two pieces of creative, in my view, that should be informed by strategy. I think the quote that you're talking about, I don't know whether they're talking about a client brief or an agency creative brief. And obviously those are two really different things. Sometimes the client does come to us and says, you know, I want an idea about X. And I really think it's the job of the strategist to use every planner's favorite meme, which is, but why though? You know, to ask why is, you know, the ultimate power move of a strategist probably. And sometimes a client will answer that really well. And so you go straight into creative, right? Sometimes you don't even need a strategy from a PR agency, and, you know, heaven forbid that might be true, but sometimes you don't get a good answer to, but why though? And I think great clients are looking for impact, not just attention. And sometimes PR strategy can cut straight to attention.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Olivia, you go.
I was just going to say, I hate briefs just because I don't like being told what to do. But then I joined John Doe, and they do this thing called a reverse brief, where they take a client brief and the accounts team like kind of Englishifies it, just makes it really simple, puts it in one page, takes out all the cringe, corny words. And then since then, I'm like, okay, I like briefs now, just because before it was all like, oh, liquid on lips moment. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just used to hate that, and I just used to hate briefs, but I'm here for it now.
Well, I think it's a really good point, Olivia, because actually kind of, you know, the mark of a creative versus a strategist, right? If you were to kind of do pen portraits against the archetypal creative in PR and the archetypal strategist, you know, despite them being siblings, they are different in terms of, you know, strategists love information and stats, and there's often lots to a brief, whereas some creatives you know, don't want to read a very long document. So with that in mind, let's look at the briefing process internally. You know, obviously the briefing moment is one where both sides wait with bated breath to kind of see if there's a really stretchy proposition that the strategist has been working on, and also for the strategist to see if they, you know, if when they temperature test it, it works against the brief and what everyone's thought about it. But from both points of view here, what is the most vital information to include? What should people always have in briefs? And what, you know, what is the best type of brief, basically, for both of us, right? Dan, here we go, straight in.
The budget.
Budget, for sure.
The most important thing. No,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an old stereotype, but like the best briefs are meant to be like what you want, not how you want it. You should always kind of be very clear on what you want to, like, what the client wants to get out of the agency, and should have the kind of trust to let the agency come back and figure out the how. That's the kind of, you know, magic that comes with a long-term kind of relationship between two businesses, is like being able to have that trust and be able to get that kind of you know, outside in opinion on how to solve the right problem in the right way.
Nice. Yeah, it's very true. Although budget's the part that most creators, I think, choose to ignore. I can't see it. There's not a number there. It's a ridiculous idea with a ridiculous talent name against it. Anyone else? Any more briefs? Favorite parts, worst parts?
I would just support what Olivia was saying, which is, you know, if you can't say it in 4 lines, as depressing as that is as a strategist, you've probably worked really hard on it, you've done all your research, and you want to show off how smart you are. But if you can't explain it to someone while you're waiting for a coffee at work, or you are writing it on a post-it note, then you're doomed. And you can backfill this and you can justify it to the client with all the research and numbers that you want, but you need to pitch it to certainly the creative team and probably back to your client in a very short space of time. And I think sometimes that's the real sacrifice you have to make as a strategist, which is to say, I'm not going to put it all on the page. I'm going to work really hard to make this as short and simple and, you know, brief as I can. They're the best briefs.
Yeah.
That also works really well for creative ideas. Explain me the creative idea in a line.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but crucially, that's our output, right? Is media, is, you know, traditional PR is write it in a headline. And so actually from both strategy to creative, if you can't write it in that punchy headline, you probably aren't landing that simplicity that, you know, we've all been speaking about being the best practice in terms of our industry. Jack, Olivia, any more to add in terms of your favorite types of brief? I know, Olivia, you said you like short and sweet, but anything else to add?
I also like it when they're like, oh, we loved this campaign, something around that, just so you get a sense of the vibe. If you need to go to ooh or to ooh, so words for it. But you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think
we have a really interesting sort of test, just anecdotally, in our team. So our creative director here, Ruby, always says that if his eyebrows move when I'm briefing him, I've done a good job. So apparently, I don't know how true this is, apparently eyebrow movement is relatively subconscious. So if you have a reaction to something and your eyebrows move, it's a genuine reaction. So I always look when I'm briefing Ruby Quince to see if his eyebrows move.
That's a really good top tip. You're briefing poker face. Yeah. Jack, you were going to say?
Yeah, I think outside of like the simplicity, definitely with like a very short attention span, being able to just, okay, what do we need to do? 100% aligned. I think the other thing, I'm definitely finding at the moment, every brief is Gen Z. You know, every brief on the table is like, how do we reach Gen Z? And it's like, well, they are a huge audience. You know, where are we going to reach them? How, like, is that TikTok? Is it Tyler? You know, if the client comes back and says, we want mail online, it's like, well, maybe that's not right. So I think it's really like that audience piece I've always found is so useful in going, actually, this is the type of person we're trying to sell to, which means that if we, you know, where we're getting that coverage and when we're looking to land that coverage, being able to go on Lab Bible or Tyler or Refinery 29, whatever it may be, and working out actually how do I come up with an idea that works for these guys, because we know that, you know, it's difficult to come up with an idea that works across the entire media landscape, is really useful, because it just gives you that kind of real focus on, you know, this is the type and tone of idea we want to create, and just means that we're not trying to do too much with, you know, not enough money.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good point on audience. But yeah, and so just kind of, you know, going a bit more deeply into this is in terms of, we're talking a lot about strategists and creatives, but obviously there are the generalists that Eleanor spoke about in the beginning. So in terms of, you know, in terms of those processes as well, and kind of getting other people to feed into the brief, how much do you rely on the accounts teams to also make sure that you're actually understanding the brands that you work for, that they might speak to you day to day, and also using them to kind of elevate, you know, and feed in? Because often, you know, when we're speaking to these audiences, as Jack says, Gen Z, I'm not one of those anymore. I'm not, well, I never have been, but you know, I'm not that young. So actually feeding into briefs is a really important thing. So yeah, how much do you look to the broader team to help you? That's the question for you.
I definitely love a shortcut, like I'll be honest. And I think that actually being able to sit with a big team who are smart and have that creative and that view on media as well is so useful. And, you know, being able to sit down for half an hour with the team and actually learn, okay, what is it about this brand that, you know, what is it about the media landscape or this audience, just means that I don't have to rely so much on what I'm looking for, researching it online or reading a book. Like, you can learn so much more from the people around you than spending loads of time trying to dig into something and like make your own kind of opinion. So I heavily rely on the team to kind of give us that kind of launch pad, and often find that they'll come up with ideas that I kind of regret speaking to them in the first place, because they're great ideas. And I can't say they're my own, but that's always beneficial, again, to get the best work out.
Nice. And then moving on to that. So I think, you know, obviously we're talking about strategy and creative and the roles that we're in, and obviously everyone's been on a journey of their own when it comes to becoming a strategist or a creative. I guess it'd be really interesting to look more deeply, I know we've been talking about simplicity, into really and truly, from your perspective in that role, what makes a brilliant strategy, but then also from the perspective of you know, the creative. So I'm going to go over to Dan and Eleanor first, but can you, in a nutshell, tell us what you think makes a truly brilliant strategy in the world of PR? Just to, you know, so budding members of these future departments can actually really understand what the role entails on a day-to-day, what they can be doing to really hone that skill. But yeah, just and speaking about the kind of successes that you've seen.
Do you want me to go first? I can go first.
Anyone going?
I mean, I think in a PR agency, and strategy is a very broad church, right? Whether it's candidates coming in or whether it's looking for talent in the agency that might become strategists in the future, I look for earned editorial experience. So it's interesting that Dan talked about starting off on in a kind of news environment, because if I'm getting CVs in for a role at H&K, I look for that kind of thing, like breadcrumbs on a CV, because I don't think you can exist in a PR world and not touch that kind of editorial landscape ever. I think you need to do that. And Jack talked about, you know, earning your stripes in that world. So you have to have that. I think you'd be a bit of a charlatan if you didn't. But also it's a bit formulaic, but the people that make weird connections, that see the world a little bit differently, that might put, you know, different categories together, different topics together, people that just, yeah, make those weird connections and ask the awkward questions, usually with a bit of good grace, but that they're happy to probe on a creative idea or on a client brief. And increasingly, if you're looking at kind of skill set for a future department, I think the next thing I'm going to be looking for is who's a great AI prompter. Like, that's changing the way we work, and particularly when it comes to research or insights or, you know, even idea generation. I think how you use those sorts of tools in the future is going to be fascinating for our departments.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And actually, a fascinating topic, because it'd be interesting also to hear everyone's thoughts on obviously the debate around AI and how it's going to take all of our jobs in the future as well would be an interesting topic. But before actually we move on to that, anything else that we can talk to kind of budding creators and strats about in terms of learning?
I love what Eleanor was saying about connecting the dots. Like this is one of those things I actually had to like sit down and write a kind of a note for, because for me there's like 3 key points to like what I look for in strategists, and that is like curiosity, imagination, and perhaps controversially style. I think a lot of stuff gets kind of bogged down in the kind of data, and when data is at such kind of parity, anybody can buy the same data as anybody else these days. Like it's more that kind of curiosity that's, I think, important. Like I want to work with people that want to know everything about everything, right? Especially when it's outside their own interests or tastes. I don't need more people that think or act like me. I need to work with other people with different views. I want to work with people who can imagine a better future, who can dream up ways for the kind of client's business to do better, win more, grow faster than the other brands in the category. And I want to work with people who have a point of view, that have a really interesting way of seeing things, and have almost I don't know, a feeling of how things should be done, and a way to convince people. I worked with an incredible designer called Adeline for a number of years, and she always said that she hired for taste. She could teach anybody how to do anything in Photoshop, but if you didn't have some kind of innate sense of what is good or bad, you know, in terms of its overall artistic merits, then there was no real kind of hope in the long run. And I've tried to kind of internalize that piece of feedback for strategy. I think it's something interesting to think about in a role that doesn't get a lot of credit for its creativity.
No, yeah, 100%. And I think actually what's brilliant working with lots of different individuals, I know Dan and Olivia, you've just gone to new businesses, but learning from different people's styles, because actually quickly what I've learned, having been a strategist and, you know, had the opportunity to work with our brilliant new head of strategy here at the Romans, Bianca, but also working with people like Jack or Jordan, who Dan used to work with, you realize that everyone across everything, even, you know, in accounts, people have different styles in the way they work. And actually that's a wonderful thing. You know, mine and Jack's ideas, say, for instance, are incredibly different, but it doesn't mean either's right or wrong. And I think that's a really good point around strategy, is kind of, I don't know, I always felt like actually strategy is like a, you know, a very strong feeling that you have about something that you can substantiate, that also speaks to the culture of the audience that you're talking to, but also the brand's DNA and who they are, and actually how they have the ability to speak. And so, yeah, I think style is a really interesting thing, because, you know, in style, do you mean, you know, writing style, or the style of the ability to form an argument, or just, you know, the style of the sort of things that they're looking at in terms of their references that they take from those media titles and stuff like that? Kind of, could you delve a bit deeper on style for us?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above. At the end of the day, we have to make an informed decision, a recommendation of what to do in a situation that is sometimes very complex. Not even just for consumer brands, but as Eleanor was saying earlier, like for corporate businesses that are having, like, you know, a serious issue or challenge. And it's not just the data and having enough charts that gets it over the line. It's the way that you present it, and you tell your story, and you craft your argument, and you present your thinking to either your creative team or your client, or, you know, the senior layers of your own business sometimes. The way things are presented is as, you know, important as the material itself. Obviously, you have to have done your homework. You can't just lacquer over it with like sweet design, but you need to know what you're talking about, but also be able to do it in a kind of a compelling way that makes people want to come along with you. Like, no strategist is ever going to, you know, drag the business forward by telling people what to do. We have to inspire, we have to entice, and we have to kind of make people want to drink our Kool-Aid.
I think I really agree with that point about diplomacy. And actually, good strategists are usually the best diplomats. You know, they know everyone, they speak to everyone, they can, you know, relate to all sorts of different people. And so actually being a bit of an empath, being a diplomat, but also never, ever thinking you're the smartest person in the room. And I think sometimes strategists get a bad rap for that. Like, actually, you should always think of yourself as the dumbest person in any brief, because you're the one who wants to find out everything. So I think that sort of humility and diplomacy is often a forgotten thing on a good planner.
Yeah,
I
have
love
to
that.
admit,
That's
like, the best privilege of my role is being able to ask the stupidest questions.
Absolutely. Like biggest kind of like, you know, reveal of the strategy career is you can make a career out of asking really obvious questions.
Yeah, I love that, because it feeds into that kind of debate that everyone, and we were talking about earlier before this webinar started, but about imposter syndrome, and actually how, you know, no question's a stupid question. That's a brilliant, empowering thing. I mean, you know, everyone should feel like they can put their hand up for anything. So yeah, I love that.
And I think off the back of that as well, with being a creative, like, it's just getting comfortable with failing. Like, I think when you first start, you know, as a junior, you have an idea and you want to take it to the senior creative team, but there is, you know, you have that feeling of like, oh, but they're going to be like, you're an idiot, no way. And you kind of have to build with that. And even, you know, go into the teams that, you know, what ideas they like, you come up with an idea, you love it, you know, they're going to hate it, but you give it a go. And if you fail, you know, you learn from it and move on. I think the more you fail, you know, generally with what we do, the more you learn along the way. Like, you have to come up with 100 bad ideas, and then suddenly your next 10 are amazing, you know. So it's always just that like perseverance of doing that, that always just, yeah, will seem to help.
Yeah, thick skin. No, very, very true. And so, Olivia, over to you. What do you think makes a brilliant creative? What are the kind of core skills for anyone listening?
I think just like believing in your idea, and like there are times and no one's liked my idea, and I've been like, no, we're putting it in, and the clients ended up liking it, and you're just like, well, I told you. So yeah, definitely just believing it and just standing by it, and just any idea that you come up with has to elicit some sort of emotion, like whether it makes you sad or happy or cry. And I always just simplicity. Like my parents don't know what PR is. I've tried to explain it, they still don't get it. So, but when I explain a really good idea, they're like, oh, I get it. So just being able to pitch your idea in a sentence,
yeah,
is the sounds of a good creative to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like, you know, is an idea a good idea if it's only kind of, you know, commended by people that work in our industry or write for Campaign magazine? Probably not. Flipping it over, right? This is the moment. This is the moment where we all give each other a bit of advice. Strategists, what do you think makes a brilliant creative? What do you look for in a kind of creative counterpart that you love to work with day to day? And we'll do the same question at the creatives. So
you want to take this one first, Dan?
The best creative I've ever worked with, they have an uncanny ability to see the thing that everyone missed, right? And then they can make other people see it as well. And often when they do that, I get my favorite feeling in this whole game, which is, God damn it, why didn't I think of that? That's so good. And that's kind of what I work for. I love that kind of moment when the amazing idea comes out of the air. And then the other thing that really good creatives do is they get to work and they work it up. I cannot stress how sometimes it feels like the difference between the amazing creatives and the LinkedIn creatives is that amazing creatives do the work and they work it up and they do it again and again and again until it's perfect. And the LinkedIn creatives talk about it. Real creatives like create stuff. It's like an absolute pleasure to see.
Yeah,
love that.
I've really enjoyed your kind of sibling analogy during this, Viola. And actually, I think I perversely enjoy creatives that give me a really hard time, because I think if you squabble, it means you give a shit. And so I actively look for people to squabble with in creatives, because it makes my briefs better. I hope they would agree it makes their work better. So yeah, a bit of sibling squabbling is a very happy thing in our team. But also I look to the creative team to love the work, like that passion that that team always bring, whether it's seeing other people's work and just appreciating it rather than picking at it, or just bringing me things that I've not seen, even the things that they might do kind of out of work hours just because they're creative people and interesting human beings. Yeah, that's what I get a kick out of, is just passion for being creative in all parts of life, not just the work.
And that squabble is a passionate squabble, because it
Yeah,
comes
for sure.
of wanting it. Exactly. And it's lovely. I completely agree. I love a bit of a healthy debate, let's call it, not a squabble. But yeah, I think you're totally right. It shows actually that people care about the work, and they want to do well, and they want to make it as strong as they can possibly be. So yeah. Brilliant response. Thank you both. Jacqueline, Olivia, what makes a brilliant strategist? Your favorite you've ever worked with or work with currently?
I think definitely like that. I mean, I love the arguments 100%. I think that's where we can agree. But I think that the collaborative process is always the bit that I enjoy the most. Like, I've had conversations with strategists before where I'm like, your process is creative. You go in a hole for, a week or two, and then you pop out of a strategy and you're expected to get it right, first time, 100% there. Whereas again, as a creative, I'm allowed to come up with 20 terrible ideas before I can get to the 4 that get signed off. And I just think that that's so like unjust. I think really, actually, we're both doing a creative role. You should be able to come with a strategy and be like, actually, here's one that's not right, and here's one that I think is okay, and start working with that. And I think when you do that collaborative process, before you even get the brief or the strategy doc or whatever it may be, I'm already able to think of ideas. And I think that second where you're sat there, and again, that bit of like, that's smart, and I can run off on my train home and sit and think about it before I'm actually supposed to be working on it. Like, that's the bit where you really get that feeling of this is working. And then of course, halfway through we have the argument, and then we go to the pub after the pitch, and it's all fine. But I think that whole relationship, like those ups and downs, when you're just enjoying the entire process, is when the job is just incredibly fun. And especially when you end up doing great work at the end, then it's always a bonus.
Yeah, I love it.
For me, what makes a good strategist is if I agree with you. No, I'm joking. Usually it's just like, if what they've written, they've kind of backed it up with evidence as to why you got because then it's like, okay, fair enough, you've got the evidence to say why you approached it this way.
Olivia, go back to you. If you don't agree, you're not into it. Not for me if I don't agree. But no, it's a very good point. So what we've gleaned from that is actually everyone likes having a bit of a fight because it shows passion, but ultimately we all love each other and love working with each other, because actually creators need strats and strats need creatives, because it obviously helps us make the strongest possible work and the work that we all collectively feel the most passionate about when the eventual campaign comes out. I think we've only got about 8 minutes left. I know we've got a couple of people on the line. Did anyone have any questions, or did any of you have anything to add? I don't know how the questions function works, so I'm just hoping something pops up at the bottom. Let's see. There's nothing on the Q&A. Oh, no. Okay, fine. Well, then there's no questions, I don't think, unless anyone's furiously typing one now. Did any of you... Oh, here we go. Can we go back to, here we go. Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, back to the AI question. Sorry, I forgot about that one. AI. So of course, we've all seen that AI is in the media, apparently going to nick everyone's jobs and make us all completely redundant, and we'll be plugged into headsets kind of trying to scrabble away or scrabble back for our jobs. But what do you think the introduction of AI, what impact will it have on both the professions of being a strategist and creative? Will it impact it positively? Is it already doing so, or negatively? And will we all really be out of the job, retired at 40, 50, whatever?
So I've tried AI and I don't get what the hype is, because it gives me the same idea. It's given me a flash mob, a tasting menu, and I'm like, oh, and then people are saying, oh, it's the prompts you give. No, I don't think it's the prompts. I just don't think it's that creative. So I think our jobs are fine. And then another thing is, a lot of people are doing like AI images, and I'm like, is this collab real? Is it not? I just think everyone's a liar now. So it's not trust people.
I'm old enough to remember the first time we tried to launch some ad agency tried to come in with their AI creative director, and for whatever reason, there is this deeply self-loathing streak in our respective industries where we're trying to give away the gold, the creativity, the thing that we do that matters the most, and just like reduce it to nothing. And that really upsets me. I think that if we want to be talking about AI, we should be talking about AI making more time for strategy and creative, not less, right? Like we want to be AI, maybe AI the account directors, don't AI the creatives, don't AI the strategists, AI the accounts payable, AI the people that chase the invoice. Leave the thinkers and the creatives to get to work.
I massively agree.
Yeah.
I really agree with it giving more time to the disciplines that are represented here, because it's a bit like a sidekick, right? You can get it to do some legwork for you. You can get it with the right prompts to reach into some credible sources, or, you know, it's also quite fun to try and break it, right? To get it to contradict itself, to get it to discover those weird connecting of dots that we've talked about. So I think you can use it. I know from a creative perspective, people have talked about it being a good first draft, or actually getting some of the obvious stuff out of your brain and off your desk to think about and give you space to think of the alternative stuff. So I think it's an interesting, like, yeah, sidekick. It's not a superpower.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the one benefit I'm definitely kind of getting from AI is the image creation, because you know, whilst, like, you know, when you're creating a deck, and, you know, visuals are so strong, we know that a deck that looks good and has visuals that explain what you're trying to say will basically make the whole process quicker and more effective. And whilst we can sit on Photoshop and, you know, try and get to amazing polished mock-ups, actually, if you can get someone to do it in the background whilst you're polishing your copy or coming up with another idea, it makes it just much easier. And then when you've got that mock-up to be able to share throughout the deck, not just, you know, a couple of good ones. And I know that our design team are definitely happy about it, because it means that when I'm coming with, can you just do these quickly whilst I do something, I'm busy, they're like, yeah, fine, we'll do it, because it's not taking a lot of time. So I think it's definitely got some bad parts. I know we've been learning that it doesn't do hands very well, and gives you some very odd feedback. But I think that, you know, we're just at the beginning, and I think it is scary how beneficial it is. The more it maybe learns a bit of emotion, then maybe our jobs are in trouble. But
well, I always wonder on that, Jack, and actually kind of going back to something Dan said about style, is everyone has their unique style, right? And yes, you can say to AI, please write something in the style of Shakespeare, Dolly Alderton, or whatever, but crucially, it's not your style. And so when you're presenting that back to a client, you know, how much do you actually believe in that? And like, how bad is the imposter syndrome when you're presenting an entire deck that is not in your words, it's AI's words, and it's in the voice of Dolly Alderton, not you.
Although I am fully expecting everyone's new interagency meeting game to be type in to ChatGPT the top 10 ideas to launch the next toothpaste, and see if anybody else presents one of those.
Yeah, it's very true. It is very true. I think, as you said, I think we've been using it a little bit, you know, just in terms of actually kind of it does a ChatGPT does a very good search of the entire internet. And if you don't want to be looking back into kind of news articles to find, you know, things to substantiate claims back from 2007, then actually it spits it out pretty quickly. But more broadly than that, I feel like maybe we don't know the full kind of benefits of it just yet, because we're all kind of new and working out what it does. But yeah, definitely, I think sidekick feels like the right phrasing. Any more questions from our lovely watchers? Thank you, Charlotte, by the way. That was a great question. I'd completely forgotten that we were supposed to come back and talk about that. So right, well, I feel like we've got a bit of silence here, so I just want to say a massive thank you to all my top panelists, as I called them earlier. But I think really interesting chat, and obviously you know, it's great to actually not just have a bunch of creatives or a bunch of strategists on this call, but actually both to really hear, you know, the details and the minutiae of that working relationship, the strength of both of them together working in unison, but also, you know, core learnings and things like that people can take if they are interested in furthering their career in either creative or strategy, or stepping into a role in one of those specialist jobs in the PR industry or beyond. You know, actually very applicable learnings within this. So thank you all so much. Yeah, it's been great.
Nice one. Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
Bye.